Welcome to Secret Squared. I'm Cassie Secret.
I'm Megan Secrets.
And here's our dog Daniel, who once again wanted to hop in for the fun.
Today we're going to keep going on our series on exponent rules, and we're going to cover negative exponents.
Let's dive in.
So to start with the negative exponent rule, it sounds exactly like the rule sounds. We're going to use it when we have a negative exponent, which is a lot more straightforward than maybe the power or the product rule is. Before we go into exactly what the rule is, we're going to play around with some numbers to see what happens when a negative exponent actually does show up.
Because again, one of our really big goals of these videos is to explain why the exponent rules are the way they are instead of just giving you the rule to memorize.
And that really helps you remember rather than just, like Cassie said, trying to memorize it. So we're going to use like 5 to the 0, 5 to the first, and 5 squared as some numbers to mess with.
And in this case, we're not using any variables because to help find the pattern, it's a lot easier if the base is actually a number instead of like x.
5 squared, that's 5 times 5. We have 25. 5 to the first, just 1 5. We multiply it together, so we have 5. And 5 to 0, we covered in our prior video on zero exponent. Anything to the 0 power is just 1.
So now we're going to start to end up finding a pattern, but our goal is to figure out what's happening. What does 5 to the negative 1 look like? What does 5 to the negative 2 look like? Now, to do that, let's look at what we already have. Now, I want to go backwards because I want to head in this direction where the negative exponents are. So to go from 25 and then get to 5, we are dividing by 5.
Same idea to get from 5 to the 1. We're going to divide by 5 again.
So that pattern is going to keep holding even as we get to the negative exponents.
So if we go from 1 and we're trying to see what 5 to the negative 1 is, we're going to divide that 1 by 5. And that's going to give us the fraction 1 over 5th. Sorry, 1 over 5 or 1/5. Same idea again, if we want to go from 5 to the negative 1 to 5 to the negative 2, we're going to divide by 5 again. 1 over 5 divided by 5 gives you 1 over 25.
And what you might notice is 25 pops up in two different spots, and so does 5. Now, 25, those numbers show up whenever you have 5 and the exponent is 2 or negative 2. And really that 5 squared is the reason why 25 shows up. And the only difference is when you have that negative exponent, all of a sudden you have that fraction with the 25 on the bottom.
So pretty much what that negative exponent tends to do is it moves that term to the other side of the fraction, or in this case, because we started, this is on the top of the fraction or the numerator, we have now that 1 5 gets moved to the bottom and it turns the exponent positive. For something to be the most simplified, we normally do not want to have a negative exponent involved.
And so that's really why we're interested in figuring out how to rewrite it. So kind of this pattern that we're seeing here is going to give us our negative exponent rule. What we're going to do, if you have something, some x, and it's to the power of negative a, and a is just standing in for any number.
So which means you have a negative exponent pretty much.
Exactly. The way to get rid of that negative exponent is to take that x and to the power of negative a, move it to the other side of the fraction, which in this case is the bottom, and now the exponent is going to turn positive, which is our goal.
One other version is in the first one, the negative exponent was on the top of the fraction and it moves to the bottom.
Now, if you have a hard time seeing that this is on the top of the fraction, just a reminder, you can write it as like over 1.
Another option is that negative exponent could actually start on the bottom of the fraction. So it could look like 1 over x to the negative a. So we have that negative exponent, but it's on the bottom of the fraction. To get rid of that negative exponent, we are going to shift this term to the top of the fraction, and then the exponent turns positive. So we could rewrite this as x to the positive a. So we still have that same exponent, it's just the exponent is now positive instead of negative. And just a heads up, most of the times, the more common version of this rule is the first one, where your negative exponent already starts off on the top of the fraction. However, sometimes you do see the other one where the negative exponent's on the bottom. So it's just really important to keep in mind to get rid of that negative exponent and to turn it positive, put it on the other side of the fraction, whether that's the top or the bottom. So for our first example, we're going to see a few things with negative exponents. You could, if you wanted to, start this with dealing with the negative exponent. I'm going to say it's a lot easier, especially if you see that you are multiplying terms together, to wait to the very end to deal with the negative exponents.
And this problem, like ones we've seen with like zero exponent rule, a lot of times like zero exponent rule and negative exponent rule are things that you want to deal with at the end of a problem. So a lot of times you're going to want to do something else first. Now, in this case, since we're multiplying these terms, we're going to use product rule first.
Reminder, for the product rule, you are taking the exponents of the same terms or the same bases. For instance, we have this is an x, that's another x, and we're going to add the exponents together. In this case, we have a 4 here. There's no exponent right there, so we are going to say that it's really an invisible 1. We end up with the 4 plus the 1, so we get an x to the 5th. Note that there is that coefficient or that number in the front. We have a -2. Right here, there is not any number in the front. Similar idea, we are going to assume it's an invisible 1 that is there. So we have a -2 times a 1. So we have a -2 in the front.
And we're just multiplying those together like normal because when you're dealing with exponents, they need that common base. But if you just have a number, numbers multiply with each other just like they normally do. So we have that coefficient in front. We have the x's that we dealt with. Now we want to deal with our y's. So I have, with product rule, you're going to add those exponents. -3 plus 2 is going to get me y to the -1. So let me go ahead and highlight that. And then our very last one is we have a z, but we don't have a z in the second term, which actually means it's going to be a little bit easier. You don't have to change this z at all. I'm just going to go ahead and grab it and bring it over here because it doesn't have any other z's to combine with.
And from here, we want to simplify things as much as we can. So the first thing is we do have something that has a negative exponent. So we're going to deal with that first. We end up with a -2, the x to the 5th. So I'm just going to keep everything that does not have a negative exponent. And this is going to turn into a fraction. That y is going to drop to the bottom of the fraction. So we have 1y, now it's on the bottom instead of the top. We still have a z here. We still have the x to the 5th, and we still have the -2. I will say the biggest thing is we do technically have another negative somewhere in this question.
So when you're doing this, and this is probably the most common mistake people make, negative exponent rule, if you see a negative exponent, you take it and move it to the other side of the fraction. 9 out of 10 people, especially as they're first learning this, are going to take the -2 and move it to the bottom. Do not do that because it only works if that is a negative exponent. This -2 is not an exponent. It is a coefficient out front. It can be any number, positive, negative, and you're not going to move it.
So this is actually going to be our final answer. We do not need to move that -2.
Now, for our next example, in this case, we have a negative exponent, but it's actually on the outside of these parentheses here. Like we were saying in the previous example, a lot of times negative exponents, you want to wait till the very end to deal with them and to do any other rules you can first. Now, because I have those parentheses with that exponent on the outside, that is telling me I'm going to do my power rule. So when you're doing your power rule, I'm just going to start by giving exponents or writing exponents for everything on the inside of the parentheses. Again, if you don't see an exponent, there's an invisible 1. And then for our power rule, you're going to take the exponent on the outside and multiply it to the exponents on the inside.
So we're going to end up with still the 2, the x, and the y, but now they're going to have slightly different exponents. So we're going to have 2, and now instead of having just that 1, we have 2 with that 1 times -2. So the new exponent is going to be a -2.
And again, right now we're having a negative exponent, but we're going to wait to the very end to deal with it.
Next term, we have an x to the 3rd. 3 times -2 will give you a -6. And then we have that very last one, we have that y. We have a y to the first power. And then we have that -2 on the outside, so we'll do 1 times that -2. We end up with y to the -2.
And from here, what we want to do is we want to take this and get rid of all of our negative exponents.
And this is the first time we've seen several negative exponents. Deal with them one at a time.
So I know I'm going to have a fraction, and anything with a negative exponent moves to the other side of the fraction. So going one at a time, that is a negative exponent. So I'm going to take that 2, and that negative exponent is going to turn into a positive 2. Dino, do you want to be in? I think our dog wants to be in the video. I apologize. And that -2 is going to turn into a positive 2 that goes on the bottom.
And then same steps for the x and the y. X is 2 negative exponents. So we're now going to move the x to the bottom, and now we'll have x to the positive 6. Same idea with the y. We have y to the -2. We're going to move it to the bottom, and now it becomes a y squared. So there's that y term. Here's our x term. Here's our yellow term, and our 2 term.
So one thing to really pay attention to is that top of the fraction is not empty. I know there's nothing there because everything moved, But if you think about it, there's always like a 1 times. You can always write like a 1 being multiplied with whatever you have because multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. So really, we can put that there's still that 1 left over on the top.
And last thing to simplify it a bit is we don't really know what x to the 6 is or y squared is, but we know what 2 squared is. So we can rewrite this as 1 over 4 x to the 6th y squared. I will say there is one other way to do this problem. Let's say you really feel comfortable with the negative exponent rule. Another way you could have done this at the very beginning is you could have noted, hey, all of this is raised to some negative power. You could have rewritten it as 1 over 2x to the third y, and then now all to the positive 2 instead of the negative 2.
Now, either way, either the one that we did on top or this alternative way, they're going to get you the exact same answer. Just pick whichever one makes the most sense to you. Again, if you're starting out and these rules are more unfamiliar to you, I definitely recommend just waiting and dealing with all those negative exponents at the end. However, if you're feeling comfortable and this seems like the easier way of doing it, definitely do that.
So for our last example, we are still going to use that negative exponent rule, but instead of having like the product or the power, we're going to see the quotient rule pop up. Just like we've done for all of the previous exponent rules that had the quotient rule, we're just going to go bit by bit. We'll deal with like the x's, the y's, and then the z's. So starting with the x's, we have x cubed divided by an x squared. Reminder for the quotient rule, we are just going to do that top exponent minus the bottom exponent. 3 minus 2 will give you a 1. So now we have, oops, sorry. Yeah, we have just an x. I'll just put a 1 to the first.
Again, you don't have to put that exponent of 1. However, it can be very helpful to see what you're working with.
For the next little chunk, we have the y term. We have a y squared and a y to the 6th. Still going to be that top exponent minus the bottom exponent. 2 minus 6 will give you a y to the negative 4. Even though right now it does have a negative exponent, we're going to put it on the top of the fraction. We are not going to deal with that negative exponent quite yet.
Exactly. And then for our very last one, I still have my z, but I only have one of those z's I just have the z's on the bottom. I don't have any z's on top. So that means that the z's, you're not going to change them, not going to move them. Just for now, I'm not even going to deal with the negative exponent. I am simply just going to rewrite the z where it already was. So from here, we dealt with all of the quotient rule that we could.
So we have one x term, one y term, and one z term.
Exactly. But now the issue that we have left is to have a fully simplified answer, you don't want to have any negative exponents in there. So we want to take the y's and the z's, those have negative exponents. So those we're going to have to use our rule for. Just to start, I know I'm going to have a fraction, so I'm going to draw my fraction line. I know that my x has a positive exponent, so that's going to stay on top. That doesn't move, doesn't change. But the things that do have negative exponents, you're going to have to switch the sides of the fraction.
So looking at the y, this is going to look like this part of the rule. We have a negative exponent, and that term is on top of the fraction. So we're going to take that y, we're going to move it to the bottom. It is going to keep its exponent of 4, except now that negative 4 is going to turn to a positive 4. So here's that y term, here's our x term.
And then our very last one is our z term. Now, this z is starting off on the bottom of the fraction. So that's actually the second half of our rule. If it starts on the bottom, to get rid of that negative exponent, you flip it to the other side of the fraction, which in this case, your z is going to end up going to the top. That's what takes the exponent and makes it positive. Let me go ahead and highlight that. And I know that it can definitely feel weirder because most of the times you are going to start with the negative exponent on top, but if something like this shows up, same idea except it just moves to the top of the fraction.
And we have one x, one y, one z. There's no more simplifying we can do, so this is going to be our final answer.
Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.
If you have any other topics you want us to cover on later videos, leave them in the comments below.
We'll see you next time!